It's 3:01, and I see that folks are still trickling in, but we're going to get started. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you here in with this important conversation. My name is Rachel Carr-Shunk. I'm a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians, and I serve as the Deputy Executive Officer for StrongHearts Native Helpline. I'm your host and facilitator for today's conversation. Before we begin, we do want to share a really quick poll to just help us better understand who's in the room with us. So if we could launch that poll, take just a quick moment to fill it out. If you're a family or friend of a loved one experienced violence, a caring community member, it just helps us better understand who is in the audience today. All right, for those who are just joining, if you could fill out the poll, and we're trying to understand who's in our audience, and then we'll close it out in about 10 seconds. All right, thank you so much. Okay, so we have a good mix of people in the room, DV and SV resources, family or friends, caring community members, or advocates. And thank you so much for joining today. So, for those who may be new to StrongHearts Native Helpline, we're an organization dedicated to offering a 24/7 confidential and anonymous lifeline to American Indians and Alaska Natives experiencing domestic or sexual violence. By calling or texting 1-844-7-NATIVE or 1-844-762-8483 or chatting online at strongheartshelpline.org, survivors and those seeking guidance can connect with advocates ready to provide culturally honoring support. As October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we are committed to providing spaces like this where advocates, community members, and change makers can share knowledge, stories, and tools for change. Today's webinar is focused on unraveling the layers of domestic violence and holding space for the journey of healing. Over the next hour, we're going to be diving into domestic violence as it pertains to historical and multi-generational violence in our communities. We'll explore culturally rooted paths to healing and restoration, and we'll discuss ways to strengthen community support and safety. I'm thrilled to be joined by our guest, Abigail Eiler, who serves as Clinical Associate Professor of Social Work at the University of Michigan. She brings over 20 years of experience working in tribal and non-tribal communities across the country and in Canada. Her clinical and macro experiences are driven by her commitment to child welfare and include family support services, trauma-informed care, and cultural humility. We're so grateful to have Abigail with us today. So with that, we're going to get started. I'm going to hand it over to Abigail to introduce herself, and then we'll get started with our questions.
Miigwech. Niigaanii Gimaakwe Dishnakaz, Shani Tuskara Undao, Mako Undorum, Hamandini and Undonjaba, Canton, Michigan Undao. I'm honored to be here today. This is a topic very near and dear to my heart and to our community. And so I look forward to the conversation. As someone who's been working in this space for, when you said 20 years, I was like, wow, it has been a while. But not just working in the community, but living this experience and recovering from this experience, and being able to share that with others is always been at the forefront of my practice. And I think that my name, She Who Leads Woman, initially I thought that was like I need to always be telling my story and kind of pushing the needle forward. And I've learned along the way that listening is such a valuable tool. And so I look forward to today's conversation and look forward to listening to those that are going to participate via the chat. And yeah, so thanks for having me, Rachel.
Yes, of course. I'm so excited you said that. And I'm really excited to listen to you and learn from you. And I hope that our participants also engage in the chat. And yeah, we can go through that as we move forward. So I'm just going to get started with our first question of today, which is, so how do you define the different forms of domestic violence? So physical, emotional, financial, psychological. And then how does this show up in our communities based on your experiences with your practice? And yeah, so I'm just going to hand it over to you.
Sure. So I think a big part of domestic violence is it's any behavior that's used to gain control and power over another person, or even another group, because sometimes it's not just an individual, sometimes it's the entire household. And so I think that's important. I think the other thing that many of us know is that this is not just domestic violence isn't just physical, right? It can be emotional. It can be financial, where people are controlling finances, spiritual, being limited to spiritual practices and being able to engage in health and healing, and psychological. The things that we say to each other or that have been said to us can be very damaging. And so I often remind people that control and fear are really at the center of all these forms of abuse. For our communities, I feel like because it can include cultural and spiritual abuse, we see people being, taken away from or pulled out of ceremony, or, you are this way because of, right? So our culture is used as a mechanism for harm as opposed to a pathway towards healing, which is what our communities historically have always been about. So when we recognize these patterns, I think it's really essential that we learn to understand that violence isn't part of our tradition. It is something that we've been taught through colonization, through multi-generational pain. And so unlearning it is really part of our collective healing. And so when I think about how this shows up in our communities based off my experience, I look at both my clinical work and then my involvement in the community. So I think domestic violence and my area of practice has been really specific to sexual violence and sexual abuse. And so I see how that appears through multi-generational and intergenerational wounds, and how sometimes it's passed down through silence and shame and unresolved trauma. A lot of times we're told like not to talk about things. And so survivors may carry both personal pain and the pain of our ancestors, those that came before us. And that has significant implications for how we might function. So when I think about healing, and when I think about Native communities, it doesn't just happen in isolation. Um, it's the harm that has created the isolation, right? And so it really takes our entire community for us to heal, and be part of a network of relatives and elders and advocates. I know that you said that we have advocates on the call today, and helpers that can really help us rebuild trust and safety and belonging, because community is at the center of our pathway forward.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, I heard you mention how a lot of the times culture is a path towards healing, but unfortunately for natives in that experience violence, a lot of the time that culture is used against them, which you referenced. And so I think that's such an important dynamic to talk about when we're addressing domestic violence in our tribal communities. So thank you for sharing that. So what roles have you had while serving the Native American community and university students, and how have they intersected with domestic and sexual violence?
Yeah, I always feel like I'm a person that wears many hats. And so, um, I've served as an educator, so I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and I've been on faculty since 2014. I've been a therapist, whether in training or licensed, for 20 years now, and a member of the community. So I work with Native students and families and tribal partners in different capacities. And in those roles, I've seen how domestic violence and sexual violence affect mental health, more specifically in my current role, academic success, the impact that it has on academic success, and community connectedness. In my role as an educator right now, I feel like part of my responsibility is to open my door to as many students as I possibly can, so that we can support and one, develop a relationship, because our relationships are what help serve as a protective factor for us, to the unspoken traumas and the history of violence that sometimes has existed. And also it's been an opportunity to uplift the strengths and the wisdom and the courage that sometimes gets overshadowed in our community, but is so strong. And so at the university level, they always recommend, go ahead and refer students to CAPS, which is our counseling and psychological services. And as a therapist, yes, it's an option for students, faculty, and staff to use those as a resource, but it's not all that we need. We need each other. We need care and community, and for that to be present. So I would say with my work, like regardless of what role I'm sitting in, it always focuses on creating a safe, culturally grounded space. So whether that's through therapy, through curriculum, through talking circles, I feel like having a space where we can process trauma, learn boundaries, sometimes new things that we haven't been exposed to before, and reconnect, or even just connect with identity as a sign of or source of strength has been really helpful. And the reason I say connect with, because some of us at times of our life have been very disconnected from our culture. Some by choice, some not by choice, dependent upon where we live and access to different resources. So I think it's really important that we have an opportunity to connect or reconnect.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm going to use that as a plug, of course, to, for our helpline, right? Our advocates, all of our advocates are American Indian and have, shared identity or shared experience of that and how valuable that is to a survivor who may be reaching out for the first time or, away from their tribal community, disconnected for whatever reason. So again, I really appreciate that insight into there's all these different forms of healing and trying to, recover and move away from the violence and how it's not just, therapy or it's not just that it's a mixture of all of those things and how important it is to be, connected. So I appreciate that.
Mm.
So, in what ways can survivors begin to unravel the trauma and layers of their experience? Because, as you said, there's so many aspects that domestic violence and sexual violence, impact of our life, whether it's academics or mental health or, all kinds of areas of life. So, how can survivors begin to unravel that trauma?
Right. I think part of it is going back to our teachings and our traditional ways. As someone who, I said Makwa and Doram, so, I'm a member of the Bear Clan, and part of that is about ensuring safety and ensuring that folks have a just and equitable life. And I think that's really important. So for me, um, to unravel trauma and the layers of it, and there's so many layers of it, right? We're kind of like onions. The healing starts with safety, emotional, physical, cultural safety. And so I think for survivors, we can begin to unravel trauma by naming the experience and being very explicit when we name it. I think the other thing that's important for us is that being believed, honored and respected. One of my aunties, every time she calls me, she asks me how I'm doing. And then the second thing that she says to me is, I love, honor, and respect you. Every single time. And then before we get off the phone, she says, I love and respect you. And so it's like this continuation of being believed, honored, and respected helps us find these spaces where we feel seen and heard. And creating that is really important for establishing like a place for trauma to unravel. I think the other thing is that like our minds desperately want to leave the trauma behind. But there's a psychologist and psychiatrist, his name's Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score. And so our bodies keep us trapped in the past, sometimes with or without words. Those emotions and those feelings can be really hard. And so in therapy, we might bring in things like grounding practices, smudging, meditation, just really being in the present moment to reconnect with body and spirit and mind, so that we can reclaim our traditional ways of healing. Sometimes it's also through ceremony, right? Or storytelling, and writing and advocacy. Like there's so many different ways in which we can start to heal. So we peel back these layers of fear and shame that I mentioned earlier, to rediscover parts of us that we think were broken, but they were actually never broken. They were just suppressed. And A big thing in my practice is I focus on something called post-traumatic growth, Rachel. And some people have heard of post-traumatic growth and other people haven't heard of it. So I always like to break that down a little bit when I talk about it. It's about these positive psychological changes that can happen post-trauma. So post a traumatic event or series of events, to be quite honest, because a lot of times the events are not siloed, they're not singular. And so through coping, we're able to enhance our resilience, which I think is wonderful. It's like a deeper, stronger coping mechanism. We have a deeper appreciation for life after, right? So the gratitude and appreciation to get through even the simple things, in addition to the really hard things. We find deeper meaning and purpose in who we are, because sometimes that can feel like it's been stripped away. And then improved relationships. That's a big one for me. Because people will say, like, I don't know about getting into another relationship. Like, I don't trust anymore. But what we're really saying, if we look at it differently, is that I want a relationship where I feel loved, where there's empathy, where there's compassion, and where there's safety. And then finally, and always, I think important is our spiritual growth. We find new insights about the meaning of life and the meaning of our lives, both individually and collectively. So I like to shift our thinking instead of looking from a situation, because when we look from a situation, we're really emotionally connected to it and we can feel trapped, and look at the situation, right? So we can think more critically about it to say, when I'm looking at it, this is what happened as part of fact, and this is now what I'm going to do, taking some of that control back
Mhm.
for healthier relationships, which we all deserve. Deeply, we deserve that.
Absolutely. There's just so many things that you've touched on that I think are really, profound, and I'd love to expand more on some of it. But there was one in particular, you talked about the body's keeping score of trauma and things like that. And I think in our communities, because of the traumas that I think all humans face, on a day-to-day basis or throughout our lives, but also in our communities, the historical trauma, right? Like that blood memory of trauma. Can you speak a little bit to that and how, you can cleanse or, you talked about smudging and meditation and stuff for some of the tr direct trauma that we experience, but in terms of healing and unraveling that, historical trauma that we have and
Sure.
experience.
Sure. So I actually I go back to our teachings when it comes to that. Um, I initially, when I was taught about the seven grandfather teachings, one of our elders, she just, everything she says, she just cracks me up. She's like, don't forget in order for there to be a grandfather, there needed to be a grandmother. And so she'll always say, oh, it's the grandparent teachings. But when I was initially taught about the seven grandfather teachings, I realized how much of an effective tool it was for a healing journey. And so initially, when I think about Bessel van der Kolk's work in The Body Keeps Score, it's really becoming much more comfortable and balanced within ourselves, our families, and our communities. And it's not just about moral values, it's really about a pathway to restore our spirit after harm. And so when survivors start reconnecting with our teachings, whether you're able to go and hear these teachings or you're reading about them, there's so many different ways to, right, learn about the seven grandfather teachings. We often rediscover our identity, which is our sense of purpose. It's our sense of belonging. And those are things that violence try and take away from us, right?
Mhm.
They try and take away our purpose, our sense of belonging. And so to restore those becomes really important. If it's okay with you, I can kind of break down how I use the seven grandfather teachings, both
Yeah.
clinically and then in my own recovery. Is that
I
okay?
would I would absolutely appreciate that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I say is, love, right? So like we begin with this sense that love is central, right, to all that we are. And for many survivors, violence distorts what love means.
Mhm.
right? And we can start to like look at what love is and what love isn't. I thought my previous partner was in love with me. I realized that it wasn't love. It was lust, and it was very unhealthy and very toxic. And so reclaiming love, especially love for self, becomes critical, but also love for community. Even when we feel like maybe community has failed us, like sometimes it's like, well, people knew what was going on, but no one stepped in.
Mhm.
It's hard to get away from it's me, right? Or I experience this because we've really kind of been pushed into this like individualistic mentality where we really are a group of like collective communal people. And so if we can reconnect to community and reclaim purpose and a sense of self within community, we have also then reclaimed life, which can be one of the most powerful healing acts. And so love is rooted in respect and compassion. And it allows for us as survivors to rebuild trust, first within ourselves and then within others. Um, and what I had mentioned earlier, one of my aunties, she always says, like, I love and respect you. And so the second one I always talk about is respect,
Mhm.
because respect teaches every single person, um, even those that have been harmed, that they carry inherent dignity, right? As a social worker, one of the pieces in our core values is the dignity and worth of a person. That
Mhm.
everyone has dignity and worth and deserves that. And so survivors often we need to relearn that we are worthy of love and belonging and care, and that their voice matters and that they matter, we matter. So respect really holds that, and it holds our community accountable too. So it helps us ensure that like these cycles of harm aren't repeated, and that's really important. And then that brings me to the next one, bravery. This requires us to be brave, right? And to have the courage. So we call on survivors and community to face our fears with that courage, to speak the truth and to seek safety and for advocates and helpers. I remember and Gigi and I were having this conversation years ago. I said, what does it mean to be a Oshabewaskwe? Like, it wasn't about me being someone that was like a healer because that's not my title, that's not my role. But I wanted to be a healing helper, right?
Mhm.
I wanted to be someone that like helped guide people through their healing journey and process. And so it required me to also be brave and confront systems that have failed people, and to speak out even when it was uncomfortable, which then brings me to honesty. We've got to name what happened without minimizing it or hiding it. And that's important because violence thrives in silence and secrecy.
Mhm.
And so, if we can be honest, we can break the cycle because it calls on all of us to be honest about what we know. I also think it helps reduce the lateral violence because sometimes we can get really chatty about what's going on in other people's homes, but not actually realize that that gossip is like fueling that toxicity. And so we don't need it, right? That's not who we are as a people. So if we can be honest, then we can help survivors that are seeking support and deserve that support. And humility, probably one of my favorite teachings. It reminds us that our healing is a collective process, um, that no person has all the answers. Like I will never say, I know exactly what to do. I may have ideas on what to do, but it's going to take all of us. Like we all have to play a role. We all have to honor and respect a survivor's story because they're an expert on their own experience, right? Recognizing their strengths, holding their strengths, and promoting resilience. Um, and then also, we've got wisdom and truth left. So the wisdom helps us really keep in mind that we have to be patient. We've got to be patient. This requires us to be reflective, learn from our experience, and seek guidance from those that came before us. I also learn a lot from our young ones, right? It's not just our elders. I learn a lot for our young ones. That goes back to the seven generations, right? Like we want to act and function in a way that the seven generations, that follow us will be impacted. And so I try to move through my life that way, so that that cycle of violence ends with me. And my children don't have to endure that, and my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and those that I will never physically meet, but hopefully spiritually come in contact with down the line. And then truth, because that ties together all of our teachings, right? Um, Truth is both personal and it's collective. It's knowing who we are, where we came from, and how we live our life with balance. And so I always look at, for communities specifically, um, truth is about acknowledging the historical trauma that you brought up earlier,
Mhm.
but not staying stuck in it. It's part of our reality, but it's not all of who we are.
Right.
And so I think about like our pathways forward, and that requires each other. So the truth is we've got to mend each other to heal.
No, I really appreciate that and kind of including, pieces of each of the teachings. The love for community, I think, is so important. Especially you talked about the lateral violence and things like that, right? And sometimes maybe survivors don't feel comfortable in spaces where maybe you mentioned being angry or being upset because these things happened to you. And so really kind of moving through the teachings, getting wisdom from our community, have and sharing love with our community and how important that is, and what that brings to healing. So I really appreciated all of those points. And I know in the chat, we are directing folks to some of the articles on our website around the seven grandfather teachings as well. So it really is in line with a lot of the things that we're doing at Strong Hearts, and all of the things that you were saying about validating and listening. Those are things that our advocates do on the lines every day. So if you are experiencing violence and trauma, or if you know someone who is, and maybe they need to talk to someone, they can always
Mhm.
call or text or chat, and you're going to get an advocate who uses these types of teachings and these practices of really honoring and respecting and loving our relatives for who they are. So I'm going to actually segue into some barriers that some of our survivors face. So can you talk about what structural or maybe systemic barriers that survivors often face when reaching out for help?
Sure. So when I think about survivors in Native communities, I do think that it's pretty unique in terms of barriers that we may encounter. Um, One thing is like jurisdictional confusion, right? Um, Tribal, state, federal systems, like there's so much that can transpire dependent upon where you live, whether you're enrolled, not enrolled. So I think that in itself is just complex of like, where do I go and who is going to support me through this process? I think is one thing that comes up quite often. The other thing I think that's important to recognize as a barrier is sometimes there's just a lack of culturally competent services, which is where like Strong Hearts really comes into play, like being culturally responsive and competent. But that's not true for all services that are across our country. And so, that's where it takes us like kind of stepping in and educating different services so that they can be responsive and supportive. Um, I think it's important also to bring up the historical mistrust, right,
Yes.
of institution, and how past traumas have sometimes been met with broken promises to our people. And part of that like stays embedded in how we think, and how we choose to engage or not engage with certain service providers. I think specifically, so my father was a police officer, but my grandfather was actually murdered by the police back in 1959. And so when I think about like the mistrust of institution, it's like kind of this weird dichotomy of like, who do you trust, who do you not trust, and how do you work through some of those past traumas to recognize like, there has been some healing, there has been some change. And so it becomes important for us to recognize that like broken promises can be repaired,
I
right?
like that.
And I think in some areas too, especially more rural areas or even on the reserve, sometimes there's very few shelters or safe transportation options.
Mhm.
And so figuring out one of the things that we did back home was like, how can we create a community of like safe folks that can like come and like pick you up or like house you temporarily or provide you transportation to a doctor or someone else in the family's house, really just to promote the safety. It's not always about like a formal system. How do we create these informal systems within the community? And I think the other piece that I've seen, and I unfortunately saw this with my sister, is the stigma and fear of losing your children.
Mhm.
So sometimes because survivors face a lot of judgment, um, and it's not their fault, that they stay silent. And so it becomes really important for Native specific services to be part of meaningful change, um, so that people feel safer to reach out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you're actually kind of leading right into that a follow-up question about those barriers is how can we improve access to, the services and the community, whether it's, traditional services or like you said, community-led initiatives, how can we improve access to that for survivors?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, it always starts with listening, right? If we listen to survivors and we can expand Native-led services, I think we'll be in a much better place. So programs like StrongHearts, I think are crucial because they do offer that culturally safe, culturally responsive, and confidential support.
Mhm.
People need to know that what they share is going to be held in a sacred way. Um, and so it becomes really important, I think, to improve access by partnerships. Partnerships with tribes, with training providers, training specifically on cultural humility, and ensuring that survivors can reach out, even when they're in like more remote rural areas. I think the other thing too is that access isn't just about resources, it is about trust. And I mentioned that earlier. So sometimes we have to take that healthy step forward and build relationships with whether it be folks on tribal council or local, regional, national politicians to change policy on a larger level becomes really critical. And I think people are like, oh, that's really overwhelming because it's just me and my story. And is this politician really going to want to listen to what I have to say? And the answer to that is yes,
Mhm.
um, because they have a responsibility um, for protection and safety and to ensure that there's access to additional resources and people are held accountable. So I actually really encourage folks to develop relationships with local politicians and know who's out there and have them know you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you talked about like that institutional mistrust or mistrust of institutions, right? Mistrust of these systems that for so long felt like they were designed to really continue the oppression of our people, right? But how do we better engage with them so that we can improve those systems, right? And it's coming from our voices, and that's again, Strong Hearts Native Helpline was designed in partnership with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center and the National Domestic Violence Hotline because the hotline, we know we have such high rates of violence in our communities, but our Native relatives weren't reaching out to the hotline. And so in that partnership that you talk about partnership and really engaging and teaching folks, that's what really kind of birthed Strong Hearts Native Helpline. And so it was created by and for Native Americans. And so I think that's exactly, such a significant improvement of a response to our reality of high rates of violence in our communities.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, Rachel, because one of the things that I used to do all the time was I would wait for things to be created. And it sounds like one of the things that Strong Hearts did was they didn't wait for it to be created. They created it. You all created it. And that becomes so critical. Instead of waiting for things to come to us, like we can make these things happen.
Yes.
We have the strength, the wisdom, and each other to say, like, this is what's needed. Now let's do it. And
Yes.
it can be hard, right? Um, and we can do hard things.
Absolutely. I think of, just places where, Native people gather and story tell or have talking circles, and how much comes from those moments is, far beyond, I think, what, typical thought of building a program, right? And writing policies and all of this stuff, right? But really like getting people together and sharing wisdom and sharing knowledge and sharing truth, I think really helps build programs and responses that are tailored for us and specific to us as Native people.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate this conversation. What is one thing that everyone can do starting today to help unravel the layers of domestic violence in our communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. I always say one, this is part of it, right? Like we start with a conversation. So the more we start having conversations and bring this to the forefront, I think a better idea we will have of like our pathway forward. So I think that's an important part. The other thing is just sharing resources with each other. That becomes really critical. I think one thing that I have been guilty of, probably most of adulthood, right? The busier we get, the less we check in on each other.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's one thing I think we could all do is like check in on a friend, check in on a family member, and see how they're doing. Um, Another part is we love humor in our community.
Yes.
We really do. But challenging these harmful jokes that sometimes come forward becomes important, right? Because we don't want to perpetuate it. And
Yeah.
our young ones are listening, right? So when we joke about certain things, um, they don't always have the knowledge at that point in their life to realize like one, we're joking.
Yeah.
And so it becomes important for us to challenge those harmful jokes so that they learn ways forward that don't perpetuate the violence. Um, and we want to normalize. We want to normalize that this is something that's occurring so that we can move forward, right? And respond to it. Because each small action, each step that we take has a ripple effect. My sister used to say, like, change reverberates throughout the community. So if we take one actionable step, it will start to, ripple. It'll start to
Absolutely.
ripple and we'll start to see the change. So healing really begins when we take responsibility, and we put energy into our homes and into our community in a way that really breathes who we are.
Hmm.
Right. Which is strong, wise, just amazing people.
Absolutely. A lot of that I heard was, of course, laughter is medicine in our communities, absolutely. But I really do appreciate the idea of challenge, kind of saying, hey, like some of these jokes they're problematic too, right? Or they're, especially when we have young minds around us and things like that. But it really helps kind of change the narrative a bit and removes that stigma, I think, that's associated a lot of the times with the experience of violence. And just really, helps uplift all of our people as really beautiful, strong, resilient, powerful people. So I really do appreciate that. I think we're wrapping up with our questions, but I know we have several questions in the audience that I'd love to be able to get to. So hopefully we can tackle all of those before we wrap up for today. So let me see if I can pull them up.
Okay.
Okay, so our first question is, as a survivor, I see how prevalent human trafficking is. Are
Mm.
there any support groups you can recommend for people like myself who have been abused and trafficked?
That's a great question. So there are so there's lines like resource lines. I don't know if this is something that Strong Hearts also does, but I can make sure to put in the chat just some resources that are available. More specifically, if you want to like back channel me, I can put my um, I can put my email in here because I want to make sure to give you groups that are specific to your area. Unless you feel more comfortable with virtual help, um, happy to give resources that way.
Wonderful. And I will say this is being recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel. So if you need, access to the chat and things like that, I believe that will be available. So, also, of course, calling our hotline or our helpline, we can try to direct you if there's something that we can either warm handoff to or get you resource information that way as well. So, thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. Are there any recent studies about transgenerational or attachment trauma in Native communities?
Yeah, there's a growing body of research, both empirical and qualitative. So when we're talking about people's stories, right, that look at historical trauma and look at attachment in various Native communities, there is an epigenetic study. So that really is looking at the experiences of historical trauma in DNA patterns, specifically in Alaska Natives. And so the hypothesis really looks at how group trauma can impact and become biologically embodied. So I'll make sure to I can drop these studies in the chat
Sure. And
so
we'll
that people have access to them.
Yeah, we'll also follow up. I'm going to talk about it in a little bit with a newsletter. And we can, with announcing that this will be available on our YouTube, and we'll also include any of the resources that you want to share in the chat in that newsletter as well, because I'm really excited and looking forward to reading that. Yeah, there's just a lot to kind of unfold and learn about the intersections of our DNA and things like that with also our emotional experiences and historical trauma. So I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Because there was a really neat article. I think it's Bailey and Wright, and they talk about actually how our worldviews are different than what we typically would see in like colonial practices, and how disrupted attachment from like boarding school and bonding patterns like have influenced and impacted us. And so it actually looks at culturally grounded attachment practices within Native communities. Is a fascinating article. I think it's actually just from last year. It's
Oh,
relatively
wow.
new. So that might be really helpful for folks to read as well because it takes a different lens and perspective about like who we are as opposed to sometimes what we learn in school, which is much more a Western way of looking at attachment.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to read these. All right, so we'll move to the next question. Are there any specific and tested therapeutic techniques that address the traumatized body and that are grounded in Native culture?
Okay. So we've obviously got like different traditional, practices and things that we might engage in through ceremony that I have found really helpful, both for myself and those that I work with. But when I think about like evidence-based practices that researchers have done, there's a couple out there. There's one that's called like an Indigenous focused oriented therapy, which really focuses on like body, and focuses on being very client-centered and on our values, connection to land, which has been really helpful and beneficial. Um, I really turn to our traditional healers in these moments. That's what's been really helpful, because culture is medicine. And so utilizing some of those practices can be really helpful. The other thing too is, especially for youth, and I was talking to the developer of this, and she was like, "It's not normed on anyone older than 18." And I go, "But it works." So there's Honoring Children, Mending the Circle, which Dr. Dolores Sabina Bigfoot um, developed. It's adapted from trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
So it looks at how we can repair and move forward from cognitive distortions, the feelings of like, I'm not enough, right? So lovability, I'm not worthy, I'm inadequate, and just really kind of reconnecting with our values and sense of self. But we do that through different cultural practices. And again, it's normed on children and youth. But I have found that a lot of times, because our traumas start young, like sometimes we are stunted in that space.
Mhm.
And utilizing these techniques and utilizing the framework has been extremely healing and rewarding for even adults. Again, I was told like it's not normed in that population, but I have found it to be very helpful. And then the other thing, because we're so somatic, right? Physiologically, like our body carries so much. I do an exercise called body mapping. And so, like, I'll ask people where they feel their stress, their tension. And let's say someone's like, I carry a lot in my jaw, right? So it's just like the relaxation of the jaw, right? A lot of us like push our tongue on the roof of our mouth and we don't even realize it's there. It's
Just
like,
doing that.
yeah, we all do it because we carry so much. And so it's intentionally bringing it down, letting ourselves relax, because when we relax and take that deep breath, we're resetting our central nervous system that's like heightened, you know? So doing some of those somatic sensations and really relaxing helps us, our body repair and restore. Then it uplifts our spirit, our mind will follow, and everything's interconnected.
Yes. Well, these are all I'm so grateful that you joined us today and are able to answer these questions. And it's just really giving me so much more to think about, and I'm sure the audience as well. So just again, miigwech for joining us and answering these. I'll go to the next one.
Okay.
When is Oh, okay. That's a question more for us. When is elder abuse support going to be added to your services and our helpline? That's a great question and something that, obviously I think we are launched in 2017. I still consider us a young organization, but I do think that, we are working to expand our services in many ways. Youth is one area, elder abuse is another area that we absolutely have so much room to grow, and Alaska Native communities as well. So I take that comment and that question seriously, and will approach it in a way that, really kind of honors the experiences of elder abuse, because we know that our communities obviously are facing that as well. So I appreciate that comma, Norma, and we'll move to the next question. Oh, so this is a long one, but I'll start to read it. So, how do we hold accountable large organizations and nonprofits that publicly claim to have trauma-informed or culturally competent care, using Native women often as a token in their marketing or pitches, but in reality, they are not providing any services, and in fact have languages and policies that can further compound the harm happening? So that's a really, really interesting question. And I think a lot of organizations have unfortunately done some of that tokenization of Native people. So I would love to hear your response.
Yeah. This really comes out of conversations, I think, with my sister. My sister Ariane is a circuit court judge, and she was the lead domestic violence prosecutor for about 8 or 9 years in Washtenaw County in Michigan. And we've talked about like what happens when people are saying that they're doing something and they're not, or they're tokenizing or causing more harm. And any attorney is going to tell you this, like document, right? Um, so I think a big thing is like name it and document it, right? If you know specific events or incidents, whether it be the dates, the meeting, emails, policies, like collect all that information. But I think one of the things when we collect the information, it's like, then what do we do with it? Right? Because I think we're inclined to say, like, these are the things that you've done wrong, or these are where you've caused harm, and like either shame on you. And that's not helpful.
Mhm.
So it's more of like document it, name it, and come up with a pathway forward to resolve it. Because these agencies and organizations, most of them are going to continue to exist.
Mhm.
So, how can we address it in a way that they can be helpful moving forward as opposed to harmful? Because I think we're inclined to sometimes like write them off and just be upset. And we can do those things.
Mhm.
And how can we make sure that we're going to be helpful? So, name it, document it, and work towards addressing the problem, I think is really helpful. The other thing is like, we want to look at like where funding is coming from,
Yeah. Yep.
right? So if people are claiming that they're doing something and they're being funded for it, we want to leverage transparency and oversight. So look at who they're funded by, reaching out to those funders and saying, yeah, I'm really concerned because they're saying they're providing this, but I feel like they're missing the mark because a lot of those funders also have folks that they can get technical assistance from, right? And support. And so we want to make sure that people have access to those resources because they are providing a resource and service. So that can be really helpful too. Going to the board, having a conversation with their boards, right? Again, this isn't like a shame on them, even though sometimes we want to say that. We really are trying to say it needs to get better.
Yes.
And that goes back to the dignity and worth of who we are as Native people. We deserve it. And so we want to make sure that it's there. We want to reclaim our narrative and have the power to do that, right? And so that's how we push for structural change and not performative change.
Yes, yes, thank you. I just want to be like, okay, I'll move to the next question. So, how can we support deeply depressed bystanders of domestic violence, possibly more so than the victim, toward healing and recovery?
Yeah, that's important because it really does impact sometimes an entire family system or community. So, what can be really helpful is just showing up, being present, listening, connecting even them to resources because helplines and resources aren't just for survivors of the community, they're also for those that are supporting survivors. So, really encouraging folks to be able to tell their stories, how it's impacting them, so that they feel heard, respected, and valued. Um, so, showing up is the key part, connecting people to resources, um, and recognizing they don't have to do it alone.
Yes, yes, thank you so much. And yes, of course, we take uh, phone calls, chats, and texts from survivors to people support systems to advocates, right? So, if you could reach out to Strong Hearts Native Helpline for those situations as well. I have another question. What do we do when elders in our community know of abusers' actions and still choose to prioritize and honor them, often citing that they empathize with him too, and that he also deserves healing while trying to silence us?
Mm. So I think, we can agree that people deserve healing, right? Um, I think the part that becomes challenging is that we're honoring one and we're silencing the other. And that becomes really problematic. So it does become important to name the abuse, um, and to bring it forward and to see if there's opportunities for restorative justice for the person that's causing the harm. And if there's not, then it's how do we ensure the safety and well-being of other people in the community, so that it isn't perpetuated within. So I do think we need to name it.
Mhm.
I do think we need to address it directly, and say, we can't be silenced. We won't be silenced. And so what are we going to do about this? And come up with that plan forward collectively. And if people still aren't listening, then you reach out to me and I'll get involved.
Yeah, and I know you mentioned earlier about knowing in your community who are the helpers, right? And I think
Of
that's a
course.
big part of it too, is yes, every community I think likely has folks who harm, but every community also has folks who help and who want to listen and who want to honor and who want to respect. So again, knowing that in your community and really connecting with them and relying on them for that support too.
Yeah. And
Um,
never feel like you got to do it alone.
Exactly. We are a community people, right? A network of people. So I appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question. Do you have any tips for non-native organizations on creating authentic, genuine connections with native tribal communities in our community so that we can better support native survivors and communities?
Absolutely. So reaching out and getting some training on culture humility, I think is really important. Um, I think the other thing too is asking the communities in which you are like in the surrounding area or providing services to, like what you can do, as opposed to, I think a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this myself in other communities, like, oh, these are the services that I offer. And I like go in and I say, like, this is what I can do for you. Where I've learned it's like, these are the services that I can offer. What would be most helpful for you? And then those are the services that get amplified and supported. So I think the training is important, developing relationships. Those relationships, as it relates to safety and trust, come with consistency, right? So it's not just showing up once, it's continuously showing up to build that trust. I never say to folks like, oh, you can trust me. I have to demonstrate that. And so that comes over time and really embracing some of those teachings I talked about earlier, like be respectful, like be loving, all of those, teachings can be demonstrated as a service provider, right? And as an organization, not just as an individual.
Thank you. Thank you. I do have one more question I saw come in and I want to get to that and then we'll close out for today. And they're talking about fleeing domestic violence and wondering what options you have when the systems like housing and legal systems become the barriers to the resources that they offer, especially for Native families in predominantly white counties. So how can we approach fleeing DV when you're not only processing and learning about the abuse you experience, but then also doing the same for the current situation for you and your children at the same time. So this is obviously a very complex question because
Mhm.
domestic violence is a very complex topic.
Right. Um, So there's a couple different things because I don't want to minimize this. This is a very important question. But off the top of my head, some of the things that I would think of is reaching out for that immediate support, whether it be calling Strong Hearts, the National Domestic Violence Line, making sure that you've got safety because safety always comes first at the forefront. And whatever that safety plan looks like. So that's the first thing that pops into my mind. The other thing is um, finding trauma-informed supports. Um, so whether it be health centers or advocates, right? We've got some advocates that are on here. Making sure that you're linked to the closest possible programs so that you can access resources quickly. And sometimes even like bypass local gatekeepers that like are keeping people out of access to programs
Mhm.
because gatekeeping is a huge issue. I actually should have mentioned that when we talked about barriers earlier. So when we have access to like advocates and things of that nature, continue to document things. If you need help for legal services or writing grievances and filing complaints, like those are all things that are out there that people can do to support. Um, but I think the most important thing, if I'm not um, mistaking the question here, is protecting yourself and your children while you're navigating this, right? So safety plan around even technology, right? Like who has access to the things that you have access to, and how can you ground yourself and regulate in a way that can be really comforting and healing. Um, and then there's like long-term things, right? Housing, things of that nature. So let me actually, I'm going to type in my information
Okay.
so that you can reach out to me directly. We can have more of a conversation about this.
Thank you so much. So we are at our time. So one final announcement. Actually, we'll launch the poll. Our our final poll and just give us some input and feedback on this community chat and help us plan future community chats, if you will. And I'll make one final announcement. So if you haven't already, you can visit our website, strongheartshelpline.org, and sign up for our newsletter. You scroll to the bottom of the page, it's at the footer of the page, and you sign up for our newsletter. And we share articles in there, we share updates from the organization. We share, additional outreach events that we might be hosting or attending. And we're also going to share when we have this recording available on our YouTube channel. So if you aren't already, please sign up for our newsletter. And I think that is it. I want to, close out by saying Chimagwech, of course, to Abigail, for being our guest today, and Chimagwech to everyone. Big thank you to everyone who was in attendance today. We greatly appreciate it. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Mama P.
I'm a P.